You're watching India Today Global with me, Ishita Mitra.
And me, Shashank Matu.
So first of all, India is celebrating its 78th Independence Day. So very happy Independence Day to you all. And Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi just concluded his 11th address, and today we are going to look at the highlights of his speech, what he talked about, what are the goals he's outlined for the country, and what are the issues he's raised in his address. So starting with one major issue that he talked about, and which was the overarching theme of his address, was the Viksit Bharat. He talked about the ways and the means through which this country can achieve that goal by 2047, and then he talked about the reform the country needs to bring about to achieve that goal. And one point that stood out from the Indian leader was that he mentioned the anger being present in the country towards the atrocities being committed against our women, basically. And he emphasized that this anger has to be taken seriously. As you've seen, we've been talking about this, that the speech and this remark specifically comes against this backdrop where we witnessed a horrific case in India's Kolkata. There was a rape case, and it sent shockwaves across the country, and Prime Minister saying that those who commit such monstrous acts should be punished and as soon as possible, while also adding that we need to discuss this more publicly. And the victims, what happens is that discourse, when you talk about such things, we're always focusing more on the victims and rather survivors of such acts, and the perpetrators of these acts do not get we don't talk about them a lot. So he said that we need to talk about them more widely, so that there is a fear among such people when they are about to commit such crimes. And then he of course went on and added about how what we're living right now, the opportunities we've been given to breathe in a free country has it's because of the freedom fighters. He paid tribute to them in his Independence Day address. And he also, talked about the natural disasters that the country has witnessed recently. We've seen tragedies in Kerala and Uttarakhand.
The floods, especially, right? Absolutely.
Exactly, the landslides and the floods. A lot of people lost their lives and lost their loved ones. So Prime Minister expressed solidarity with them. He said that the country stands with victims of those people, and bringing climate change also into his remarks. He said that this is one challenge that we're facing globally. It's not just India, and we have to address this collectively. He said the targets out for achieving the net zero future for India by 2070, and he talked about that. So let's go ahead and talk about these points in a bit detail. So coming to Bangladesh, exactly,
Big thing,
so Bangladesh has been in news. We know that Sheikh Hasina has been ousted from the country. A new government has been established. But one major point which specifically involves India is that a lot of attacks on Hindus have been growing in the country.
Right.
In the past, let's say 2 weeks,
a week
over
or so,
205 incidents were reported. So Prime Minister mentioned that we have to bring in normalcy to the country, and the attacks have to be they have to stop right now.
Absolutely, yeah.
So Shashank, let's talk about this.
Yeah, no, actually, it's a it's a massive issue in India. I think the Prime Minister came out very strongly, said that there needs to be stability. India hopes that there will be stability in Bangladesh, and there will be the protection of the rights of Hindu minorities. This has been a topic of interest for India for the last 75 years, right? So the Prime Minister isn't the first person first Indian leader to express concern about what's been happening in Bangladesh. We did a video very recently for one of my shows, Threadbare, which was precisely looking at how India almost went to war in 1950 after independence with Pakistan because there were atrocities committed against Hindus in Bangladesh. India was ready to use military force, and since then, throughout the 1950s, this has been an issue.
Yeah, there has been several waves of violence.
Waves of violence, and I think this has always been a top priority for India. Atal Bihari Vajpayee's government as well. One of the main reasons why there was some difficulty between India and Bangladesh at that point in time was because of this idea that Hindus were not being protected, that they were being attacked. So I think that interest in each other's minorities has always been an important issue in the subcontinent, because we have such a shared history at some points in time. So when it comes to minorities, oftentimes you take an interest in other countries' politics, they take an interest in your country's politics. So this is some of the background to the Prime Minister's interest in this issue. But you're right, absolutely. There have been dozens of attacks. You've had the Bangladeshi interim government now come out, Mohammed Yunus, who is the chief advisor to the Bangladesh government, came out and said that, look, we
He's
cannot allow this to happen.
He issued an apology for this.
Exactly, and he said that, look, we absolutely cannot be in a situation. These are people who are our brothers. We have fought for the same thing together. We have fought on the same side. Now we cannot have attacks on Hindus in the country. So this is important. He's asked to meet with, a couple of days ago, he announced that he would meet with leaders of the Hindu community. So the interim government is making some of the right noises. I think what we'll have to see, though, Ishita, is just this question, right, about what happens in Bangladesh moving forward. I don't intend to make this, of course, as an Independence Day speech broadcast, but I think one of the big conversations is there is a broad coalition of forces that has come together to unseat Sheikh Hasina. Some of those are Islamist parties and extremist forces that have in the past expressed skepticism towards India. And things that are associated with India. There is, of course, also students who may not share those views.
It began with the student protest.
Exactly. And so there are things that I think we've seen that are, I think, disturbing, because the attacks on Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, the Bangabandhu, the founder of Bangladesh, on his statues, attacks on Hindus, this broad anti-Sheikh Hasina front has, yes, let loose forces that want a more progressive, more democratic nation, but also forces that actually don't want that. So which group wins out? Will you have some sort of uncomfortable compromise between them? That's going to be important. And that is what I think the Prime Minister was referring to in terms of stability. India will have to see what happens moving forward. So that's just a little bit on Bangladesh.
Also, because when we talk about the growth of country, we need to look at South Asia at large. And when we talk about growth, it is important that we have stability, within our neighborhood, if you're trying to grow, right? So it becomes important even when we talk about growth of India.
Absolutely, and this is very interesting, because in one of the few foreign policy things that the Prime Minister mentioned in his speech was that India's exports are growing, that India was contributing more to export growth. But something that I'm sure our viewers hear a lot is that India, the South Asia, which is the region that India is part of, is actually one of the least interconnected regions economically in the world, which is a huge problem, right? Because you go to North America, you go to Latin America, you go to Europe, you go to East Asia. These are phenomenally interconnected regions economically, I think. But in India and in South Asia, there are so many fundamental tensions between countries because of the legacy of partition, which, of course, Partition Remembrance Day was yesterday. The shadow of partition, I think, has has had a negative impact, I think, on our relations with many of our neighbors, which means that we're not as interconnected as we should be. So that's a huge economic issue, but which over the last 10-15 years, especially in the case of Bangladesh, India has tried to change with massive economic investments, a new agenda that involves more connectivity.
India has been funding a lot of infrastructural projects in the country, and I think we need to overcome these hiccups so that we can economically, integrate more in a better way.
Yeah, so, you're right. That's actually the huge challenge, which is working together with this. Now talk about more infrastructure connectivity, opening up rail links with Bangladesh, for example, that have been closed for the last 60 years. That was a huge focus. Trying to bring in jointly try to bring in international investment with countries like Japan, with Nepal, of course, power grid linkages and so on and so forth. These are just ideas that I think India has been pushing that link sort of economics.
And you need a stable government in the country to push forward these ideas. Who do you negotiate with? Who do you sign agreements with? When you see that there are multiple groups being involved in a power tussle just across our border. Yeah,
absolutely. I think that's the issue. Like, lots of people have written about the fact that India's whole Act East policy, which is essentially linking itself to markets in Southeast Asia, is essentially stuck now, because we don't know how the new government in Bangladesh, how open they will be to a lot of the initiatives that Sheikh Hasina was open to. And we also don't know how the situation in Myanmar will evolve, because so if the two countries on your eastern flank are essentially in a state of chaos or uncertainty, that says a lot about where your Act East
situation on our western front is
not any better. Yes, that's true. But just the simple fact of the matter is that we're in this situation at this point in time, especially on our Act East policy. So this is a huge concern, right? What happens moving forward? So we don't really have stability in the region at this point in time.
Exactly. And the Prime Minister also talked about a lot of reforms that we need to bring in India, and specifically he said that reform for BJP government is not for compulsion but for strength. And when he's talking about the growth, he's mentioned several reforms in industries like space sector, manufacturing, defense sector, and also he talked about making media global, something that's very important to us also.
That's true. Our name is literally Indian Tech Global.
Exactly. So. And so he reflected on the past achievements, as he usually does in his address. He talked about banking sector reforms that actually led India. India, it has increased India's ranking in one of the strongest, it has become one of the strongest banks globally. So he emphasized that right now, the kind of time we're living in, it is golden. It is the golden era for India, and we cannot let this opportunity slide if we want to move forward and develop and become Viksit Bharat by 2047. So let me just list out the kind of reforms he talked about. So as he began with modernization, that we need to work towards more technological advancement. We need to be at pace with how the world has been moving so far, and our policies have to be more integrated globally. And in health industry, we have seen a lot of hiccups recently. We had a lot of paper leaks that we witnessed very recently. So he announced that India is going to bring in about 70,000 more seats for medical institutions. And I think that's a big announcement coming in when we talk about the domestic health industry specifically. And let's talk about another global point. He talked about terror attacks. We've seen in Jammu and Kashmir in the recent time there has been an increase in terror attacks. From infiltrations from across the border have increased, and right now he said that India, which was once a victim of terrorist attacks, has now become bold and strong. So let's talk about India's response, how it has changed when we talk about its anti-terror strategy.
Right. No, actually, it's important because I think the Prime Minister, again, talking about what has been something that people see as a very strong point in his record, the surgical strikes that took place in Pakistan, of course, several years ago in response to terror attacks. This was, of course, was used very much by the Prime Minister as a sign of India being a very different country. Of course, in 2008, for example, after the 26/11 attacks, there were no military strikes against in Pakistan, despite the fact that we had intelligence.
Like we've gone from defensive to offensive.
I think that is the narrative that the Prime Minister has, of course, tried to push, and certainly that on terrorism, he has tried to push this narrative that, of course, this government in particular is going to be much stronger on those issues. But of course, the counterpoint to that many parties have been raising, especially in the last couple of days, is what's been happening in Jammu and Kashmir. It's an absolute tragedy, but increasing questions being asked about.
Last day only, like yesterday only, we saw this Indian Army
captain had been
got killed in action.
Yes, absolutely. So I think that this is the concern that over the last couple of weeks there has been a steady string of terror attacks. You may have heard in Doda district, in Riyasi, all across the state.
Specifically that how attacks have been shifted from Kashmir to Jammu now.
Yes, exactly. So there's a lot of questions there about intelligence failures, about, of course, as always happens, right? As always happens, of course, the army has its own perspective, pushes back often on these perspectives of intelligence failures and so on. But simply put, that these questions have come up about how India and the Indian government is handling this. There have been several senior top-level meetings on security. Very recently, the Cabinet Committee on Security met as well to discuss what's happening on Jammu and Kashmir. But while I think the Prime Minister has made the right point in terms of what his government is around terrorism, I think the counterpoint also exists increasingly that the string of terror attacks in Jammu and Kashmir has in some ways undermined the government's record on terrorism and on national security. It, of course, has not become a massive political liability at this point in time, speaking right now, but it is something that is acquiring.
We never know how this.
But it's been acquiring increasing attention, and it's in not a very comfortable place for the government, and in fact, the people of India to be in.
Correct. As you mentioned that the response has not been very fruitful, specifically in the recent past when the terror attacks have been rising in India's north. So let's come back to other reforms that the Prime Minister spoke about. A major issue that we often raise in domestic politics is of corruption in India. So Prime Minister clearly said that corrupts will face action now, and the glorification of corrupt has to be stopped. Maybe it's a reference to other political leaders, but he did not take any names this time. So let's see about that. Another reform that his party has also been mentioning since long time, and he's also been talking about, is one nation, one election. And he also touched upon this, that the time has come for nation to adopt this policy, so that the expenditure and the time that this country spends on conducting elections can be reduced. Then he further went and talked about climate change. He said that the country is moving towards net zero future, and it has fulfilled its Paris Accord target. Now, this is an important point because we've seen in the recent past, this government has been working on a lot of climate change goals. We've seen a lot of green policies coming in. And the fact that India has been has been able to fulfill its Paris Accord target, because globally, if you see the proportion of countries who've been able to maintain that, it's very low. Specifically, the countries who've been high contributors to carbon emissions. You have China, you have USA, and all of these developed countries. What they usually do is that put the blame on developing countries to adopt more green policies, and at the same time, they don't see the burden right now for the countries who are still in their growth period. Like these countries, they've had their growth period and they've contributed, like their carbon emissions have already peaked or are about to peak. But for countries like India, we're still in the period where our carbon emissions are rising, and then we'll reach a level where they're going to peak, and then we slow down, of course, and bring it to the prescribed limit. So, but often the burden comes on developing countries, and right now the Prime Minister has mentioned that we have been able to achieve our Paris climate goal, so that's a big point coming in.
Right, I think so. I think that the Prime Minister mentioned the climate crisis in last year's Independence Day address, so it's interesting to see that it has featured again. And I think that anyone who's been I mean, perhaps this is too Delhi-centric of view, but anyone who's been in Delhi over the last couple of weeks and months has felt, I think, across the country for the first time, I think people are talking about climate change in a way that impacts.
Which is new,
impacts exactly.
Political leaders are talking about
exactly, right? I think that it's important that this gets talked about more. In fact, just across the country, I think this is the first time that I can remember we in fact had a roundtable discussion with all the members of the India Today Global Office, where we talked about our personal experiences with this. Having family in, for example, Himachal Pradesh that is increasingly at the risk of forest fires, what we're seeing in terms of more extreme weather events, natural disasters that we've seen, what happened in Wayanad and so on and so forth, where, man-made erosion of the environment is exacerbating natural disaster tragedies and so on and so forth. You've had major concerns with heat waves, how many people died across the north in India this year, how uncomfortable it's been sitting here in Delhi. So I think that for the first time in my memory, the climate change has become something that I think everyone is talking about in a way that everyone has woken up to it. It's reached a popular level now of consciousness. So it's reasonably good to see the Prime Minister refer to what India has been doing on that particular front. So always interesting, I think, to see climate feature
something like this becoming a discourse of a speech of a political leader is very important, because now the impact of it is becoming very explicit. We've seen our agriculture is being impacted, our economy is being impacted. So we need to talk about this more. One interesting point that he also mentioned is about India hosting Olympics. We've just concluded Paris Olympics. We got so many medals, and now that we are ready to host Olympics, so let's talk about that.
Yeah, well, this is, I think, an important thing. I think people have discussed that India should look at hosting the Olympics.
And this is after a tally of 7 medals.
6 medals, I think, this time. 6 medals, I believe 5 bronze, 1 silver. But I think that the problem, so there's absolutely one thing is that I have to say the countries that host the Olympics, of course, get a lot of public attention and scrutiny, which is often helpful. There are a number of times in the history of the Olympics that countries have actually used the Olympics to announce that, hey, we've arrived on the world stage and we want the world to see how developed and advanced we are. 1964, Japan country was completely wrecked by the Second World War, but by 1964, it had grown, it had sleek infrastructure, it was a much richer country, and it wanted to show the world that Japan had changed, and Japan had arrived once again. 1988, South Korea, Seoul hosted the Olympics, today one of the most powerful economies in the world, and Beijing, China in 2008 hosted the Olympics as well.
It has sort of become, if you see, like a PR event for the country.
It is. It's a massive PR event, right? So, the idea is that India will host it in 2036. The idea is that in a very tangible way, it exposes people to your culture. It brings the world to your to any city that you so choose. But the problem, of course, with that is, at one level, of course, it's fantastic for your global image and to announce that you have arrived on the world stage. That's very important. But the Olympics comes with massive costs in terms of building infrastructure. Oftentimes, the poorest citizens suffer because you have to meet certain standards. You have to build infrastructure that after a while goes unused. Will you have the sports infrastructure and the teams and the athletes to use the infrastructure once you have built it? Brazil in Rio in 2016 had a lot of these problems that you build extremely expensive football stadiums that then become unused because there's no one using them. So there are serious issues that it's, of course, very satisfying for India to want to host the Olympics, but I think the bigger questions are what will it cost? in terms of how many billions of dollars, what will it cost in terms of displacement of people in a particular city or wherever you choose to host it. And I think that those are important questions, to the point where there are serious proposals now that the Olympics should really rotate between a preset number of cities, 5 or 10 cities across the world, global cities that already have the infrastructure to handle the Olympics, and it should rotate between them rather than, in fact, it's an interesting thing, Ishita, and I'll close with this. I won't bother our viewers and you too much, which is that, in fact, one of the funny things is the number of countries that have bidding for the Olympics has substantially decreased over the last couple of years. In fact, so bad was the situation that the Olympics had to make the International Olympic Committee had to make a massive decision this time, which it had never done before, which is that because there were so few bidders, there was bidding between Paris and Los Angeles, and after that they had no bids for future Olympics. So what they did was that 2024 they gave to Paris, and 2028 they gave to Los Angeles. Yes. But what they do after that, no one really knows, right? So if India is seriously happy to make a bid and spend the kind of money that the Olympics Committee would like, fantastic. I think that India will stand.
India has bid for basically 2036.
Yes. So India, it's certainly possible that India would be able to win that bid, because there's so few countries interested in hosting the Olympics anymore. But the question is, why are they not interested in hosting the Olympics? And that's because there are serious drawbacks.
And also the kind of messaging we want to send when we actually do that.
Right. So I think that it's an important question. I used to be a very enthusiastic supporter of us hosting the Olympics, but once you get beyond that and you actually look at the figures, what it's going to cost, what the impact is often on people who are sometimes in the poorest segments of society, you sometimes begin to think that there's a good reason that lots of countries in the world today don't want to host the Olympics anymore, because of the expenses, because of what it costs, because of the infrastructure that you need to build out. So there's serious questions that you will have to handle if you want to host the Olympics, but it's plus and minus.
Well, that's all on this live for today. We've discussed what Prime Minister said on his Independence Day address, and we'll come back to you for more updates. Stay tuned to India Today Global.